Okay, so that brings us to chapter 6, first 11 verses. And verses 1 through 11 of chapter 6 have a title on it of the shame of the righteous taking disputes before the unrighteous. That's a lot of words. The shame of the righteous. Paul shames them, the righteous, for taking disputes before the unrighteous in secular courts. That's what we're going to see here. All right. Verses 1 through 5. Let me read those. I want you to think about this as I'm reading. I'm going to give you just a little preview. We don't do this. We don't do this. When I read this, you tell me if you think that the Christian world does this. I had a thought this morning, and because it was this morning, I didn't have time to go look it up, but something came to me. I want to ask anybody if they know about the year of Jubilee and how that worked under Jewish law.
That's when you forgive all debts and
Release the slaves.
release the slaves, and basically any obligation anybody has.
That's the way I understand it too.
All property.
Yeah. Now, does that sound like something you want to do? Gary owes me some money, and we're on the year of Jubilee. I say, Gary, you don't have to pay me. Sounds good for Gary. Doesn't sound that great for me.
Do you know that they never celebrated that?
That's what I'm getting ready to say. And I'm saying this, but that's important. That was part of law. But to my knowledge, they never celebrated that one. How many times are you going to release your slaves?
Yeah.
The people that wait on you hand and foot and do work for you. How many times, you loan money? It makes you not want to loan money if you know 7 years from now you got to, okay. Okay, the only reason I brought that up was not because of how it actually works, but the financial aspects of it. They never did it because I worked hard for this money and I don't want to give it away. Now this, what we're talking about today is about a court system, about Christians not taking their disputes to secular courts, but resolve them themselves. Now, the reason I brought up the year of Jubilee is not because that applies to us, but this does, and we don't do this. And maybe you can make cases for and examples for things like the year of Jubilee where you might get caught in some shady deal, and you feel like if you let your Christian brothers deal with it, that they're going to see right through your shady operations, and they're going to rule against you. But if you take it to a secular court, the judge is your wife's husband, and he might rule in your favor if it goes to his court. So we just don't exercise these things. I want you to, as we read through this, I just want you to pay attention to this and just kind of see if you think we really do this. We should do it. I mean, Paul says we should do it, but we don't do it. And if you want to argue with me about that, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you, but it does not look like it's something that we do. So let me read the first 5 verses. If any of you has a dispute with another Christian, this is believers. If any of you has a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame to shame you, is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? So I'll stop right there. In chapter 5, we discuss Paul's directive to the church to expel believers with habitual sins which do damage to the body of Christ, the church. He directed them to make the necessary judgments for such, indicating that they are qualified to make such judgments. They can judge those matters, spiritual matters, within the church for other believers. Okay? Now we're coming to something different. This is not spiritual matters we're talking about. These are legal matters. These are lawsuits and court appearances for various things and for whatever. It's not, you can kind of see this thing where the elders come together to discipline this guy. You know, who's better to discipline him than people like believers that are all alike, okay? They should be able to handle spiritual matters. This is not spiritual. So let me read verse 1 again. If any of you has a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? Dispute. What kind of dispute would Paul be talking about? One that would qualify for secular judgment? These disputes, are they secular judgments, you know, where a secular court could rule, or are they spiritual judgments? I already told you the answer. The spiritual we talked about in chapter 5. These are, it's like a regular old lawsuit, you know. Guy slips and falls on ice on your sidewalk, breaks his back, misses 6 months of work, and you didn't keep your sidewalk clear, and so there's two sides to everything. You were out of town, and you couldn't do it, but yet he fell, and somebody has to pay. Well, see, that's the thing. We're talking about two different sides here. And now, it's not a spiritual matter. This is the kind of thing that you would sue somebody over. Now, do you know of any situations, anywhere, have you ever even heard of a situation, maybe you don't know it specifically, but have you even heard of it, where a situation like I just described, mailman or another guy come up your sidewalk, slips and falls, has a significant injury, keeps him out of work, where they would take, and he's a believer, in your church, let's make it really specific, he's a believer in your church. Have you ever heard of a situation where that situation would be taken to the elders to judge, or would it always go to secular court? Down city court, county court, state court, whatever. Well, what I'm saying is, do you ever just say, well, we're Christians here, we can work it out?
Maybe a fender bender or something like that.
Well, that's what Paul's talking about. He's saying you should be able to work it out. You're talking about brothers. Now, I'm not talking about one Christian and one non-Christian. I'm talking about two Christians. If you're talking about the believer and the non-believer, they're going to end up in secular court every time. Okay, that's the dispute. He says, dare he take it. It's for emphasis. Paul uses the word expressing shock and indignation at the behavior towards one another, to think you can't work it out yourself. I had a pastor one time that could not understand divorce. He said, I do not, between believers, where you have a man and a woman or both believers married for however long, and they end up in divorce. He never understood how a divorce could not be worked out between believers. Never understood that. So Paul is just kind of the same way. He's in shock and indignation about this thing. He says they're not willing to properly evaluate and exercise judgment in cases of blatant immorality, which could destroy the church, but are willing to go to public courts and are out airing out their dirty laundry to settle disputes with each other, the brothers. You got brothers that are willing to go to secular courts and air out their dirty laundry there, rather than to sit down in a closed room and work it out amongst themselves. We're going to get deeper into it as we go. Paul's outrage is not about the dispute, but about their willingness to have it settled in secular courts. That's what he's upset about. The secular courts are what he's calling the ungodly and the unrighteous. I've forgotten which way it's put. It probably depends on your translation. Ungodly or unrighteous is the secular court. And then he talks about, let's see, I added some more notes. It is more a matter of the world. He's not demeaning the court system, because the Roman courts were good. I mean, they were fair and just for the most part. But so he's not demeaning the court system. I suppose our judgment would be more involved. Oh yeah. If you did not take it to the courts, the secular courts, but you resolve it in a room full of Christians, however that would be worked out, they're probably going to be more involved with it and more stringent with it than a secular court might be, because what do they put on it? They put an added distinction of a requirement of love. Jesus required us to deal with relationships with love. I don't ever hear of that in secular courts. I don't ever hear the judge sitting up there on the bench saying, well, you need to be loving this guy, and just kind of overlook what he did. You don't ever hear that. But so you get in a closed room with the Christians, and then you can have that requirement to deal with. So Paul is not demeaning the court system as unjust. He is just making a moral judgment of them when believers are well qualified to judge themselves. All right, let me keep going. Verse 2 and 3. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? Now, don't get me too far into this, talking about this again, but do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? Now, that can't be a surprise to you. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about judgment seat of Christ. Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? How much more the things of this life? Don't you know? Don't you know? He says it several times throughout this section. This should be a trivial matter for your understanding. Don't you know? The saints, these are believers, will judge the whole world. And he even steps it up a notch, and he says that they will even judge angels.
What would angels have to be judged for? If they're angels. Yeah,
I don't know, what do you think?
Heavenly beings.
What do you think?
I don't know. That's why
What are you asking me?
I don't know, maybe you've obviously probably read more
Actually,
than me and read that they should.
all right, you got a comment on that, Wayne? Now, let me before we answer that, let me just back up a little bit. When we had talked about the judgment seat of Christ, what Paul is doing here, I can't answer that question.
So maybe it's just a reference or just saying.
It's for real. He's not speaking figuratively. But Paul has this question he's dealing with. Why aren't you dealing with it yourselves? He said, this is a worldly thing, and he is likening this worldly, everyday kind of stuff that they're dealing with as trivial matters. And he said, if you're going to later on be given the world to judge, and that he even stepped and said, and that includes angels, you ought to be able to handle this without
little thing here.
without even wearing yourself out. Now, what he was talking about, Jesus came right out and said that the apostles will be judged from 12 thrones. If from Matthew 19:28, we can read that if you want, just so you know I'm not making it up. Matthew 19:12 says that 19:28 says this. He's talking to the disciples, and they're wondering who's. Well, let's see. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished and asked, "Who then can be saved?" Jesus looked at them and said, "When with man this is impossible, with God all things are possible." Peter answered him, "We have left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us?" What will be for us? And here's what what Jesus says. Jesus said to them in verse 28, "I tell you the truth, at the renewal of all things, which is during the millennium, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones." Now he's talking to 12 disciples right here, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's one area of judgment. They're going to be given authority to judge the Jews. There's also Revelation is filled with it. Revelation 2:26 says that's one of the gifts to one of the churches who overcomes. What he says in Revelation, and I'm trying to make a point with you here. Revelation 2:26. If you recall, we went through all those 7 churches. He talked about what they should be commended for, what they should be rebuked for, and then there was always a promise to those that overcome. The church in verse 2:26 was Thyatira, and he said, "To him who overcomes and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations." Authority over the nations. We're going to judge. Everybody won't, but those that overcome, those that are faithful to the end, and those that are faithful to the end will be judged. You remember when we talked about the wood, hay, and stubble, and the gold, silver, and precious stones? We talked about, we had the foundation was Christ, and then you build on it 2 different ways, and all ways in between. Wood, hay, and stubble, and all that. Jesus is going to judge us according to our faithfulness. Believers, you're judged righteous immediately when you're saved. And then from the point you're saved to the point that you die or he returns, your faithfulness to him is judged. And it's judged at the judgment seat of Christ, and that's where we get our rewards. Those that are judged in a certain way are going to receive more authority to do various things. That church was told that kind of church or that kind of people are going to be given authority over the nations. Okay, then there's one in Daniel 7:22. I'm just giving you 3 examples here. Daniel 7:22 says, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. We're going to rule. We're going to rule over the sinful. We're going to rule over everything, basically, but it's going to include all the people that are still in the state of sin, that live through the second coming of Christ. When we talked about sin is going to be alive and well in the millennium, because, well, it just is. And the devil's going to be locked away for 1,000 years, but sin is not dead. And so there will be judges. And we're going to be given that situation to judge those that are deemed, or not deemed, but judged and evaluated worthy for that at the judgment seat of Christ. We'll be given that responsibility. And Paul says that will include angels. And what I'm telling you is I do not know what that means. If anybody else knows or has even an inkling of a suspicion, I would like to know what it is. But I know that it's an eschatological answer to a secular current question. He's saying, you guys are more than qualified to judge yourselves. You're going to have all this grand responsibility in the future. And if you can do that, this is a trivial matter. That's what he's talking about. That's a long-winded way. I can make a short story long if you give me a chance. But that's what he's talking about. He's given an eschatological answer to the question of judging themselves. He says, gets a little sarcastic and says, you will be doing all of the very involved judgment in the kingdom as you handle these trivial matters. Verse 3, he calls this trivial matter the things of this life. That's what he's talking about. The things that are going on, common everyday things. The things of this life. It's all very convicting. I think it should be made clear that the dispute to which Paul refers is those among the brothers when Paul refers to them as one another in verse 1. So all that stuff that I just talked about is about lawsuits and disagreements. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Christians judging Christians in all matters. Now, he takes it from the spiritual matter of verse 5 to all matters. And he says, you are qualified. I mean, look at what you're going to be doing. If you can do that, you ought to be able to do this too. All right, verse 4 to 6. Let me read those. Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. Man, verse 4, Paul is hurt and outraged at their behavior in these matters of disputes. Paul, I hope you guys can see that. I mean, he does sound harsh in the way he's sarcastic in the way he talks to them, but he feels that way because he loves them. These are believers. This is a church I think he planted himself. These people were saved as a result of his efforts, and he loves them, and he can't stand. Remember, he said, when we first started studying this stuff, he said, I want to talk to you as if you were spiritual, meaning as if you were Christians, but you're not acting like it, so I have to talk to you like you were mere infants.
He sounds frustrated.
Well, he is, and he's more than, and that frustration is building into outrage because he cannot believe their behavior. Even men who are least esteemed in the church are competent enough to judge matters of the world. Least esteemed in the church. That means, what does that sound like to you? What he said was, therefore, if you have disputes among such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. Everybody counts for something. He's talking about the most not incompetent person, but a person that is not the greatest of the influential people in the church. He's talking about just an average person or even below average member is qualified to judge these matters. Why don't you get one of him? And he says, is there nobody there wise enough to even do that? That's pretty stout statement he's made. That's right. You know, one of the things, the topics that we've already covered, I think it had to do with factions. He said, I heard about this stuff.
Yeah.
Remember that one time?
The guy.
Yeah, I heard about it. And then I heard about this other guy. So he's heard about all these. He's not just thinking, I think they need to hear about marriage. You know, we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. You know, I think I'll tell them about that. He's talking about these things because he's heard about them. And he's saying, I just can't believe that you're I get out of town for such a short period, before the door slamming behind me, you guys are already going back to the way you're making up your own rules. That's what he's talking about. All right, so verse 5. Let me read verse 5. I say this to shame you. You should be ashamed. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge the dispute between believers? I think I already dealt with that. It's a sarcastic and a rhetorical question all rolled into one. Of course there is. You can go find anybody. I mean, they're not going to go get a person that's physically incapable of doing it, but he's saying for the most part you got believers in your church that anybody could deal with these things. Why don't you just use one of them? That's probably true. I think that when you go to why would you not be willing to let your brothers judge the matters you're dealing with? Why would you not be willing to do that? I don't trust them.
I may have to not get the money.
Yeah, exactly. What if they say, well, you're supposed to love that guy, you need to forgive that debt?
Yeah.
So I think some of the stuff you're talking about may be involved, but I think there's also a matter of trust. I just don't trust these guys. And that goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning when I said that the Jews never exercised the requirement of the year of Jubilee. They never celebrated. They did the celebration. They did the feast that goes with it, I'm sure. But they never forgave the debt. They never released the slaves. They never let property revert back to its previous owner. They never did any of that. And I think here we've got a matter of trust where, I'd rather let the legal experts in the Roman court deal with it. I think I'll get a better deal down there. Unless if you're going to lose, when you're going to lose down there, you might say, well, maybe we'll just let them deal with it down here at the church. But what I said here, if the matter of trust gets into it, then it would be like, you mean you don't trust a guy at the church to be fair, impartial, and Christian? But you would trust somebody in the secular court? And I wrote after that question mark? Boo. There we go, pride. I see pride written all over this. All right, verse 6. But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. Paul he loves these people, but he loves Jesus Christ. And to do something that reflects badly on the name of Christ, on the name of the church, because the church is supposed to be a reflection of Christ, reflects badly on the church. Paul takes personal offense to it. I mean, you ought to be able to see that reading all the way through this one in particular. It's got that stuff written all over it. Paul takes personal offense to this. He said, I cannot believe you would rather take your grievance to a secular court and air out all your dirty laundry right there in front of the whole unbelieving secular world. Cannot believe that. I've written it here. It's bad enough to have to go to the church, but it's even worse to cheat and do wrong in front of unbelievers. Because one of these guys is wrong. Rarely is it, are they going to the court because they're both right? They're both wrong. One guy's going to be judged more right than the other. Okay? He said it's somewhere down the line here. He's going to say it's better. He said it's even worse to cheat and do wrong and air that out. The fact that you're not acting like a Christian, airing all that out in front of unbelievers. This is just what the world wants to see, and I will tell you that is for sure. They love that. To see two Christians fighting or seeing one Christian cheating a non-Christian. They like that even better. One misstep and the Christian will incur wrathful judgment in the court of public opinion. And I wrote, that's my words, wrathful judgment. They hate Christians. Then, even more popular is said that if that is what Christianity is all about, I don't want any part of it. And Paul wants to make sure that that doesn't get into the mix. Don't air out your dirty laundry in front of the secular world. He said, because somebody is going to judge you either unfairly or with wrath. More likely is going to be judged with wrath. And they're going to use that as an excuse to not to come to Christ. Yeah, I hear you. But that's what would happen. And Paul said we need to make sure that doesn't happen, because he takes these things personally. All right, 7 and 8. Let me read both of them. The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Here's what I'm talking about. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. He said, I don't want, if you're going to act that way, I don't want the whole world to see it. He says, the fact that you are involved in a lawsuit means you're completely defeated before you start. Because what if it is one guy that's trying to take unfair advantage of the other? They're both believers. One guy's trying to take unfair advantage of the other. Paul says, I don't want the world to see that. Work it out. The two guys in court, the Christians, need to be able to work out their problems. Paul said, I don't understand why you can't do that. Verse 8, Paul says it is better to be wronged or cheated than to damage the reputation, not of the church, but of the body of Christ. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, the church is, people don't see what the church really is. When you talk about going to church, the world sees you're going to a building. But we know what the church is. The church is a body of believers. It is the body of Christ, is the way we see it. And he said it's better to be wronged or cheated, meaning just don't have any lawsuits. Just live with it. It's better than to damage the body of Christ.